Counterterrorism and Human Rights, and Letta Taylor, the Associate Director for Crisis and Conflict at Human Rights Watch. And they'll be expertly moderated by somebody who's really passionate and extremely knowledgeable about this issue and has been there too herself many times, Courtney Kube from NBC News. So thank you to the four of you for taking the time. I look forward to hearing from you.
I think we're on. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank you very much. I have to say that just about any time the Middle East Institute asks me to help with anything, I'm always thrilled to do so because I love having a group of people who care so much about issues that I care so much about. But when Charles told me who I would be on a panel with today, I actually had to pinch myself. We are really, really lucky. Not only a panel full of women, but such amazing, trailblazing leaders in this field. So I actually have goosebumps because I'm looking forward to learning so much from all of you. You already heard who we have up here. I'll just give you a little bit of bio information about each of them. Ms. Marian Gasser is Syria Special Coordinator for the International Committee of the Red Cross. She served with the ICRC for more than 3 decades, including as the head of the office in Damascus and the head of the delegation in Libya. She's also served as the head of the Damascus office for the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria. Dr. Anne Charbord is the UN Special Rapporteur for Counterterrorism and Human Rights and the senior advisor, legal advisor. I have my wrong copy here. I wrote legal on that last one, legal advisor. She's also an international human rights lawyer focusing on human rights and security, and a visiting scholar at the Human Rights Center at the University of Minnesota Law School. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees recently nominated her to serve as a judge in the French Asylum Court. And we have Letta Taylor, Associate Director in the Crisis and Conflict Division of Human Rights Watch, leading the division's work on terrorism and counterterrorism. And she focuses on the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda counterterrorism policy at the UN, including drone strikes, targeted killings, and how countries around the world manage foreign ISIS suspects and their family members, specifically what we're talking about here today in Northeast Syria, especially. And I have to add in, she was a journalist, a foreign correspondent for Newsday, which, you know, a little close to my heart here. So, but before we start today, as I said, these women have such an unbelievable amount of knowledge on this topic that they're each going to talk for a couple of minutes, give an intro, a little bit about their work and what they're focused on right now. So should we start next to me, I guess? Proximity? Okay.
No, thank you very much. And the ICRC, we are also very, very grateful to be on this panel. And I would like also to say that we appreciate the open and regular discussion and dialogue that we have with many here in this room and of yesterday, and to exchange on very sensitive issues and very complex issues where we, I think, all try to find a solution. Yes, I would like I will say a few words about the humanitarian situation in Northeast Syria. I will mainly focus on say a few words on detention, detainees. For sure, my colleagues will say much more, but I would like just to say, give some highlights, and also to build on the very relevant opening remarks that were very, very important that were said. So yes, for the ICRC, as we are all aware, the humanitarian situation in Northeast Syria, including and mainly in the camps and in places of detention. We heard this morning more than 20 places of detention, where thousands of third country nationals, but also we should not forget thousands of Syrians and Iraqis are held in these camps and places of detention. And unfortunately, the humanitarian situation in these facilities have worsened over the years. As I said before, yes, I would like to focus on the detention. We know that thousands of men and minors, we have hundreds of minors who are placed in detention for a prolonged period of time. Without determination of their legal status, without judicial process, And according to the ICRC and to others, it's a violation of international law. It has also severe consequences because the lack of review of lawfulness of detention contributes to overcrowding, deterioration on the living conditions, inadequate conditions, and also maybe in this regard, I will not elaborate, it will be touched upon after, but also a very tense security environment situation. So we are deeply concerned about the situation in the camps, the lack of inadequate infrastructure in the places of detention. Now, I would like also to report what my colleagues, we have a big team in Hasakeh covering Northeast Syria, doing assistance and protection work. And the ICRC could visit again Hueran place of detention. This is the facility which had been attacked in January 2022. And since the attack until June this year, we could not have access. So we had to, we were not allowed to visit this place of detention. And we were also very concerned because we know that many people had been killed, wounded, and especially that these detainees had no possibility to exchange family news with their beloved ones, including women and children in the camps or abroad. From the very first visits, we found the team in ICRC teams assessed an acute emergency health situation of exceptional scale and severity, including untreated weapon wounds of detainees, and tuberculosis, including multi-drug resistant tuberculosis and malnutrition. The detainees are dying because they are malnourished, and for all these reasons that I explained. We should not forget, it's, as I said before, it's not only men, it's also hundreds of minors. And we know that if tuberculosis, for example, is not treated quickly, it can spread into the community, the community at large. So we are trying, the teams on the ground are sparing no efforts to ensure that detainees receive the necessary treatment, the necessary care, but we are engaging with numerous actors and member states also, but it's very complex to set up a tuberculosis response. It requires also unimpeded access, and as I said before, sometimes we are prevented to have regular access due to the security situation in Northeast Syria. So what we were saying is this emergency health situation is another proof that the humanitarian situation in Northeast Syria is extremely dire. And we believe that the best and probable only chance of saving the detainees, of improving the conditions in the camps and places of detention would be through to reduce the number of detainees and people in the camps. It would be through repatriation of third country nationals to their home country. The return, although, and we confirm also that Iraq has returned, a lot of Iraqis could return to their home country, but there are many more, a lot of Syrians also who should go back to their areas of origin. And we think also that maybe the most immediate step would be to release and to repatriate or to return the wounded and sick, if we want to go step by step, the wounded and sick and the most vulnerable, mainly the children who are at acute risk. So maybe I will stop there because I wanted to focus mainly on the humanitarian situation in detention, and my colleagues will complete. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And let me start by thanking the Middle East Institute for inviting the mandate of the Special Rapporteur to be here today. She can't be here today because she's presenting her final report to the General Assembly this afternoon. But in that report that she will be presenting, she addresses issues that are related to the human rights and humanitarian violations related to the detention situation in Northeast Syria. And this is what I will speak to today. This follows on a technical visit that was undertaken by the Special Rapporteur last July to Northeast Syria. And it was the first visit by a UN independent human rights expert in that region. And that in many ways is hugely significant because she is uniquely placed, unlike many other actors who are currently in Northeast Syria, to name and address specific violations of humanitarian law and human rights law, with the view obviously to ending them. So let me maybe speak to some of the legal findings, which actually involve scalar human rights and humanitarian law violations that are occurring in places of detention in Northeast Syria that constitute serious breaches of international law. And that shows that contrary to what the title of this panel is, it's not just a humanitarian crisis in Northeast Syria, but it's also very much a human rights crisis. So I'll start by highlighting the main findings of the Special Rapporteur. And the violations that she has found include mass, arbitrary, indefinite detention of adults and children, torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment and punishment, sexual and gender-based violence and coercion, practices of trafficking and sexual exploitation, mass forced transfer and abduction of boy children, deliberate denial of access for humanitarian release and deprivation of access to essential medical treatment, withholding of food, i.e. starvation in detention, coercive interrogation, mass enforced disappearances, and trials that lack the basic judicial guarantees which are recognized as essential by civilized people. So I won't address all of these in detail, no worries. But maybe I'll say a few words about the main finding, which is that of mass, indefinite, arbitrary detention of adults and children, which in fact enables most of the other violations that she has identified. And I'll start with some figures, which I'm afraid are higher than the ones that were given in today's introductory remarks. The Special Rapporteur estimates that there are still over 70,000 men, women, and children detained in Northeast Syria in various places of detention, including prisons, rehabilitation centers, and closed camps. This would include over 65,000 individuals in the two largest locked camps, namely Al-Hol and Al-Raj. And that would be mostly women and children, although it must be said that in Hol, there are approximately 3,000 men. In both of these camps, the population is overwhelmingly children. It's 60% of the population, of which 80% are under the age of 12 and 30% are under the age of 5. So in these two camps, what this actually means is that there are almost 33,000 children detained, which makes Northeast Syria the largest site of detention of children for counterterrorism purposes anywhere in the world. Turning to the conditions of detention, Marianne has already said a few things, and I think many are familiar with these conditions of detention, so I'll just say that they're extremely dire. And I'll also say that security prerogatives define lives entirely for the detained population. The Special Rapporteur has qualified the conditions of detention as amounting to torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Turning now to the prisons, there are approximately 10,000 men detained in numerous detention centers throughout Northeast Syria. She estimates that that includes 1,000 detainees who were apprehended as boys and who have since crossed the threshold into adulthood, but actually that number is probably much higher. It's very difficult to have accurate figures for men in particular who are detained. And she also estimates that there are approximately 1,000 male children who are detained in either in detention centers or in closed rehabilitation centers. In most of the prisons, the men and the boys are detained in overcrowded cells that hold 20 to 25 people in inhumane conditions, and where they spend 23 out of 24 hours in their cells. There is a severe lack of access to the prisons, and most men have not been seen or heard of since 2019. There is no access to families or to legal counsel. Many families don't even know where the men, their brothers, their sisters are being detained, whether they're still alive. And there are also cases of individuals, boys, so minors, who are missing, and their whereabouts are unconfirmed by the detaining authority. The failure to keep records, the lack of information regarding such a large group of men and children who are held incommunicado with no access to the outside world, no access to humanitarian actors, to independent human rights monitors, to lawyers and doctors, and no information on their fate, amount to systematic enforced disappearances under international law. Gueran Panorama Prison, that Marianne has also spoken to, holds approximately 5,000 men and 700 children. And that prison contrasts with other prisons that we visited in Northeast Syria. It's purpose-built, it's high security, and it's of superior quality in terms of the infrastructure. However, while tuberculosis exists throughout Syria, it is rampant in Panorama. And it is estimated that between 50 to 70% of the prison population is affected. There is no ability in that prison to quarantine or to separate these individuals who are affected. And at the time of our visit, there was no tuberculosis treatment program that was in place. Now, untreated tuberculosis is a life-threatening disease that is estimated to cause fatality in approximately 50% of cases, and hundreds of individuals have already died in this prison. The men's physical condition was also of serious concern. We saw signs of emaciation, thin limbs, and pronounced or protruding bones. The abject contradiction between the quality of the security infrastructure and the reported security training that is provided to the detaining authority in that prison, and the absolute lack of the necessities for survival of the prison population, i.e. food and medical treatment, was in fact shocking. It may be worth just reminding that these individuals started being placed in the camps and the prisons from 2017, and that the numbers grew exponentially in 2019 when Baghouz fell. Individuals have since been detained for what is now almost 5 years, for some more. There is no legal basis for this detention in any place of detention, including on security grounds. The detention are not subject to any legal authorization, legal review. There's no legal control, and there's no oversight. Al-Hol and Al-Araj are without doubt detention facilities. No one can enter or leave without the permission of the detaining authority, and no one can leave out of choice. So the use of the nomenclature of camp, and even more so of refugee or IDP camp, which we still hear sometimes, is entirely inappropriate to describe what are in fact open air prisons. Similarly, rehabilitation centers where adolescent boys are being placed are in fact locations where these boys are detained, with some held in confinement conditions where they're unable to leave their cells at any point in the day, say for 1 hour. The special rapporteur also found that the human rights and humanitarian law violations observed in places of detention in Northeast Syria are not singular, but they're massive and systematic in nature. And in respect of mass arbitrary detention and all of the ensuing violations that flow from this arbitrary detention, the question may be reasonably posed as to whether the threshold for crimes against humanity is implicated by this scale, subject, and indefinite nature of such arbitrary detention and related practices. So I think I'll stop here. But
Thank you, Mary.
thank you.
Thank you, Anne and Marianne. Thank you to the Middle East Institute. Also to you, Shiraz. It's really an honor to be here and to join this panel of amazing women. I think Anne and Marianne have painted a vivid picture of what's going on in the prisons and centers for boys, locked centers for boys. I want to talk just very briefly about the mood in the camps also, which we haven't touched on, where in many ways services have improved somewhat here, gotten worse there, but the situation is really dire in the camps as well. And what I have detected most in conversations with detainees there, which are furtive conversations, because even though pretty much everyone has a cell phone, or many do, it's not officially allowed. So people can be punished, women or children, often by being locked up in toilet stalls for extensive periods for owning a cell phone. But in my conversations, I have noticed an increase in the level of despair. And that is because the years have dragged on with no end in sight for these women and children. When will their countries ever take them back? And mothers seeing their children growing up with no education, with no hope, terrified to let them out of their tents because they might be raped, they might be killed, they might be attacked by hardliners if they're too moderate. They might be snatched by the Northeast Syrian authorities. So the level of despair is intense, and it's growing also because as those who remain behind see their friends and neighbors from neighboring tents leave, they feel further abandoned and they feel increasingly vulnerable to attacks by hardliners. One woman's family has been sending me photos just the other day of a woman I interviewed there whose face was badly bruised. The family member told me that this young woman, who's a mother of two, had been beaten up because she was suspected of being too moderate, and she went out without a headscarf from her tent. And so this is the kind of abuse, in addition to deaths from lack of medical care, deaths because of fighting inside the camps, accidents such as children getting run over by water trucks. There is this daily level of violence and abuse and fear that all of these detainees are living with. So I just wanted to also talk a little bit about the camps. But I'd like now to turn to this process by which boys are selected to go into the prisons and so-called rehabilitation centers that Marianne and Anne have described. The Northeast Syrian authorities are, I would agree, systematically picking up foreign boys for the crime of reaching age 10 or older. Their stated policy is to consider separating boys from mothers once they reach 10. That's actually on paper. Many of the boys are older. Some are 13, 14, 15, but most are taken before they actually reach adolescence. Boys are wrested from their mothers in the middle of the night from tents. Boys are taken at the marketplace. Boys are taken walking down the road. And there are now reasons that the Northeast Syrian authorities provide for why they take boys, but we have serious concerns. We think that these reasons are arbitrary, in almost all cases, and the process for determining how boys are chosen, we consider highly arbitrary as well. Just to give an example, boys are taken because in some cases, because they are allegedly victims of sexual abuse. That sounds like a very good reason to keep a boy safe. I think we all agree on that. Why would only boys who are from foreign countries be subjected to sexual abuse? or at risk of that? Why would not boys from Iraq or Syria be subjected to sexual abuse? So right there, the question arises of discrimination based on nationality. Girls are also victims of sexual abuse routinely in these camps. Are girls not to be protected? If these measures are ostensibly to protect children, in this instance, why are girls not being protected, whether they are Iraqi girls, girls from other countries, or Syrian girls? So a number of questions are raised. Another justification for separating the boys is indoctrination by the mother. Well, what exactly is the definition of indoctrination? Is it, your government is bad? I think we all would have concerns about that on many levels, but many of us probably also have fault with our governments. Or is it, you should grow up and be a martyr, you should kill somebody, here's how to build a bomb? Well, okay, then I think there's a pretty clear-cut case, but we do not know where in the spectrum these boys fit. So that is also a very, very serious concern for us. There are other examples that I can go into later, but this is just to give you a flavor. We really think there needs to be a transparent process to look at this. Even if boys are separated because, for example, they are victims of sexual abuse or so-called indoctrination, who's actually the perpetrator? Is it actually the mother and the siblings from whom the boy is separated? Or are family members actually trying to prevent this and do not have the resources or is too scared of repercussions if they do? So is this really an issue that should fall back on the shoulders of the authorities? So these are among the many questions we have. We've been really pleased to see that the Northeast Syrian authorities have wanted to engage not only with rights groups such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, but also with humanitarians and with governments to try to figure out how to consider when it may be necessary to separate boys, and if so, under what conditions and what would the process be. So we're heartened to see that the authorities are looking into this, and we very much encourage all governments, rights groups, and humanitarians to help as much as possible to ensure that this is an exceptional measure that meets all international legal requirements, because right now they fall short. And I'm happy to go into more, but maybe just one last word on that. Even if there are some cases in which boys should be separated from their mothers because they may be a threat to themselves or to others, or they may be victims, the question arises, how can a boy be rehabilitated in a rehabilitation center inside a war zone, hundreds or thousands of miles from his home, knowing that his home country has abandoned him? What are the real prospects for rehabilitation? So as far as we're concerned, the only durable solution is repatriation, rehabilitation, reintegration, and of course for adults, prosecutions is appropriate. Thank you.
It's such a heartbreaking picture. I want to take a step back and look at the entire region, but first, just because of what you've just, all three of you have told us about these kids, and particularly the little boys. I mean, I guess I was always under the impression that when these little boys are taken, that they were all taken to a prison facility or a rehabilitation camp. But it seems like maybe that's not the case. I mean, do we have any idea how many of these young boys are being taken? And can someone walk us through what happens to them? That may be a difficult question, but can anyone walk us through exactly what happens to these boys when they're taken? Maybe starting with someone who's taken out of Al-Hol, what generally happens? Yeah. Well, and who's taking them?
So guards, SDF or Asayish, which are the security forces, will take the boys. They're armed. I've spoken to boys who've talked about being locked up in latrines for days or weeks at a time before they're then transferred to what are being described by the authorities and many governments with nationals in Northeast Syria as rehabilitation centers, except there's really not much rehabilitation going on, if any. And again, how can rehabilitation be successful in this environment? So boys generally are held for a while before they're taken to centers such as those called Uri and Orkesh. Many boys were taken at the time that Baghouz, the last physical stand of ISIS, fell in Syria, and were immediately separated from their family members. Many of those boys are among the 1,000 who Anne mentioned who have aged into men, but others have turned into men, were reached adolescence in the camps, then were taken to places like Huri or Arkesh, and then aged out of those centers. And once they reached 17, 18, and 19, were moved into prisons for adults. And that's where the conditions are so dire that boys also told me that they were held for 23 hours a day, that they were only allowed to play in a courtyard for 1 hour a day, where that was too small for all of them to exercise at the same time. And these boys looked very skinny to me. I wasn't allowed to go in to see where the boys were being held, so I was relying on their descriptions, but they match descriptions I've been told by others. But I am sure that the boys that I was allowed to speak with were selected because they looked healthier than some of the other boys. I don't want to suggest that the Northeast Syrian authorities are carrying out a deliberate, I don't think they are trying to punish these boys for being boys, but this is a collective punishment, just as all of the children being detained are being collectively punished for the suspected crimes of their parents. And I say suspected crimes because not one of the adults has been brought before a court or any kind of judicial authority either. Collective punishment is another war crime, speaking of the many crimes that Anne was underscoring. So they get there, and the authorities have been trying hard to increase the number of communications between these boys and their family members. And it's my understanding that in Orkesh and Huri now, that there are more regular visits and communications with family members than there were even, say, a year ago. But there are still many, many boys and boys who've aged into young men who are not regularly communicating with their family members. And I believe that the special rapporteur confirmed that as recently as July during her visit. So when these boys talk to me about everything they've been through, seeing family members blown up in front of their eyes during the fall of Baghouz, being separated from their families, either at the point of surrender to the Northeast Syrian authorities and the US, or being taken from the camps, illnesses that were not treated, wounds that were not treated. As traumatic as all that was, when they really started to tremble and burst into tears is when they talked about how much they wanted to communicate with their mothers or their sisters. And did I know if they were alive? And did I know where they were? And so this is the trauma of these separations cannot be underestimated. And I urge all governments and aid agencies to think very carefully about funding centers that may, on top of all the legal and moral violations we've just described, on top of that, are a recipe for leaving these children more vulnerable to recruitment by groups like ISIS, and because they know they're abandoned.
Do these kids or their parents have any legal rights when they're taken away? I mean, is there anything that they can do? Especially for the moms or dads who don't want their boys to be taken away? Do they have anything they can do about it?
Yeah, well, the answer, the long and the short answer is no, they don't. This is one of the issues that we pointed out, that there's absolutely no legal process. I mean, the way that this happens is, as Letta very rightly described, it's usually in the middle of the night or in public places. The boys are literally snatched. It's a summary kidnapping of these boys. And then they're taken away, usually put in a detention center before reappearing a few months later in one of these rehabilitation centers. And I have to say that all of the mothers and the boys that we interviewed who described this process to us, first of all, there's a clear pattern. I mean, it's every single story looks like the next one. So it's a clear pattern that's happening. And all of the mothers and the boys showed extremely clear and profound trauma with this, either the fear that it will happen to them because they all know that this is a risk. So the mothers try to hide their boys once they reach a certain age. I mean, we heard stories of mothers digging holes in the ground or dressing them up as girls so that they wouldn't be caught. Or for those to whom this has already happened, clear trauma from the way that it happened, and then the complete lack of communication with their mothers. It's often many months before the boys reappear and that contact is made again between the mother and their sons. Just to say one point maybe on the communications, yes, I think there is, and they are trying to increase the communications, but there is a real question as to the quality of that communication. It's usually extremely random. It doesn't happen at regular times, and it lasts for 2-3 minutes, usually on religious holidays. So we can't say that that's, it's quality communication between a mother and a boy who has been taken away like this. But maybe just to say more fundamentally about the annex in itself, because this practice happens in Al-Hol annex. And what the special rapporteur found was that the sheer arbitrariness for individuals who live in the annex. She has some very specific findings. Maybe I can quickly run through them. She has found that there's an absolute lack of independent human rights oversight and limited humanitarian access to women and girls who are in the annex, combined with a failure to keep records of persons that are in custody in the annex, a stated lack of knowledge as to whom is in the annex, a denial of contact with the outside world. So yes, there are mobile phones, but this is not authorized. So this is not something, it's not regular and normal access as you would expect in a place of detention. And no contact with legal counsels or family members that is being organized by the authorities. And so for all of these reasons, she's again found that this mass incommunicado detention probably amounts to mass enforced disappearances under international law. She's also noticed a lack of access to essential medical treatment for women and girls. The decision to provide medical treatment is not based on a medical need, but it's based on a security need, which is not quite the way that this should happen, which means that in many cases, women and girls in this camp have to negotiate access with consequences that we can all imagine. There's evidence of regular and coercive interrogation, both by the detaining authorities, but also by intelligence coming from other countries. And then there's evidence from former detainees concerning direct physical violence that can reach the threshold of torture. There seems to be also a practice of women being taken away for several weeks or months, again, absent any legal process, being taken into prisons and then being brought back to the camp. And of course, the last finding is the forced separation of male children from their mothers. So the exceptionalities in the annex that really lead to sheer arbitrariness in treatment is the rule when it comes to managing the individuals who are detained there. So the detention situation is not just about the material conditions of detention, which are extremely dire in Al-Hol, probably more so than in Al-Roj. But it's also fundamentally about being confined or having a confined existence in a complete rights-free zone. Violence is structural and direct. We know this in the annex, and there's a complete lack of protective measures. There are killings, there's violence every day in the camp. Killings happen with a certain regularity, and yet there is no investigation when these things happen. There are no measures in place to prevent recurrence. There's no capacity for any of the individuals in the annex to report harm, including reprisals by the detaining authorities. It's a population that is essentially silent to the outside world, held on a blanket claim of security, which may be right or wrong, but again, there has been absolutely no legal judicial process engaged in this. And in the annex, it's based on the individual's nationality. And there's a complete inability to protect these individuals from violence.
Just to be clear, when you talk about the annex, you mean the foreign annex?
Yeah.
El Hall is separated
Yes.
up into a number of sections and you're
Correct.
talking about. Marianne, how much access has the ICRC had to El Hall, El Raj, but more than that, some of these rehabilitation areas for young boys? Do you have any real visibility into what's happening there, more than what we've already heard here?
Well, for the ICRC, we are having access since the very beginning in 2017, Bahuz, Raqqa, and then Bahuz, and there were many more camps. And now most of the foreigners, Syrians, Iraqis were always involved, but the number has increased. So until today, we have, I would say, I'm speaking about the camps, a rather regular access. We have also opened a kind of hospital in Al Hol camp, together with, it was at the very beginning also supported by the support of the Norwegian Red Cross. But it's still, I would not say a real hospital that you can treat wounds and so, but we, at the beginning, we could treat some detainees and the people. Now, for the detention, we also had started some detention visits in 2017. It was the first visit I was there. It was Ayala prison, and then detention is much less regular. As I said, for example, I give the recent example of Hueran, place of detention. We had a rather regular access, and then from January 2022 until very recently, we were not granted access. So yes, then for the ICRC also the Orkesh and Huri, which initially had to be juvenile center or alternative care centers. But the ICRC considers it also as a place of detention because it's not, these are not alternative care centers. Due to the conditions, the minors being there detained, so, and the ICRC has issued a non-paper on alternative care center, on the alternative care centers. So yeah, we would have wished a more regular access. Then I say it depends also on the military security incidents, also in places of detention, this instability. So sometimes also for security reasons, even including very recently, the teams could not go out of Hasake city because of the clashes and the attacks. So it's very, very complex. Yeah.
I've seen you're writing something over there. Did you want to add something to that?
I'm taking a lot of notes.
I'm the same way. I write everything.
The reporter in me, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just to say that some of the coercive interrogations, for example, and other abuses that Anne mentioned for Al Hol are also taking place in Rouge, even though Rouge is considered, and inability to access adequate medical care is quite a problem in Rouge. Rouge is divided into what's called New Rouge and Old Rouge. There's a much smaller camp, much more manageable. It's a few thousand detainees as opposed to tens of thousands. But one side of the camp can only access the medical center there every other day. So if someone has a medical emergency, they have to wait for the guard to let them pass, which is similar to the situation inside the annex where women and children are dependent on guards to let them through a series of gates to get to an ambulance, to get to a medical center. And as Doctors Without Borders has detailed in, I think, a groundbreaking report about a year and a half ago, there have been babies and young children dying en route to the hospital because of delays in the authorities, the security authorities allowing children to get to a hospital. And in some cases, these children have died alone in the ambulance, meaning maybe there's a medical official and a driver in there, but no, not their mother, not their sibling. So this is the medical conditions, or the fact that you can't, it's not like I can't go to CVS and get my Advil. These are very, very serious conditions. That was just one thing I wanted to underscore in addition to the interrogations. I've spoken via texts sent through a family member with a woman who described being interrogated for hours because the authorities wanted her to inform on other detainees, and they just wouldn't let her go. And she has 2 young children, and so this was adding to her trauma and her fatigue. And these texts were just, she sounded so broken. She just was texting, I just want to die. I can't take this anymore. In terms of the women who have been taken away for days or weeks at a time, if they are considered to have been plotting escapes or other activity in the camps that the authorities consider either criminal or an infraction of the rules. I'm not justifying actions that are criminal or an infraction of the rules, except ones like a cell phone, which I really find pretty reprehensible, that women aren't allowed to regularly make calls officially. But some of these women told me that they were taken for weeks at a time and their children left behind unattended in the camps. Other mothers and older girls looked after the siblings. In some cases, the very young children have been allowed to go into the prisons with the mothers, which is hardly an ideal situation. There's even a daycare where young children are in the daycare by day and then go into the prison with their mothers at night. And I visited this daycare center, and there's very nice murals on the walls. There was a swimming pool that didn't have any water in it. Okay, it's much nicer than being inside a prison cell, but the children, they said they preferred being in a hall despite all the violence to being there and having to go back and forth between this prison cell and this so-called playground daycare center that was also it was a locked facility. It's another prison. It's another form of open air prison. So just to elaborate a little bit on some of the other observations of my colleagues.
And on the interrogations, did I hear you correct that there are foreign intelligence services that come in and into Al Hol and they can take people out and interrogate them? That's something that you've learned?
That's our understanding, yes.
I don't know if they take them out.
I'm not sure they take
I'm
them
not
out.
sure
Yeah,
where these interrogations.
But they are given access by.
Yeah.
So I want to take a step back. Who is? Let's start with the refugee camps, that displaced persons camps, Al Hol, Al Raj. Who runs them? Who's in charge of saying of how things are taken care of? I know that there's the security services, but of the humanitarian situation, of who gets access and who doesn't. I mean, who's in charge of all of this, making these decisions? I know that's not an easy question, but
when my stepdaughter was a little girl and she asked me a question I didn't know how to answer, that was not a yes or no question, I'd say yes.
yeah.
So that's a big question. It's a big question, as is the question of, are all the children that you asked earlier, are all the children, the boys who were taken from the camps, going directly to Urkesh and Huri, or some of them being placed elsewhere, and they're even in more of a black hole? There's an Australian boy who was declared dead by his family. Then a year later, a video purportedly of this boy surfaced in which he is seen to be alive. But the video only surfaced a few months ago, and it was from a year earlier. And several months have passed since then. This is at least 3 months have passed, and there's still no official confirmation as to whether this boy is dead or alive. This is just one case. This boy may have become a poster child, but he is a poster child because we don't know. We still don't know of the hundreds of people killed in the ISIS attack on Garwan prison in January 2022. We still don't know exactly how many children died, how many children went missing, and how many children were wounded. Nor do we know for the adults.
Do we even know how many children are in the prisons versus the adults? We don't have a good number on that, right? Or of the 10,000 who are in the prisons right now, the estimated, how many of them are believed to actually have been ISIS fighters versus people who've been brought in because of the report, the special rapporteur's report specifically says that kids are being taken in because of an association with someone who may have been involved. So, I mean, do we actually have any fidelity on numbers? No?
We have approximate figures. I think no one has the exact figures. Now for children, many were taken by their parents to conflict zones.
Mm-hmm.
So because and many were born in the camps.
Yeah.
So it's also tragic because they were born in the camps. They know only a Rouge or a whole camp, and so we cannot say that children are associated. And that's why also we believe also some adults detained maybe were arrested, but because they were at the wrong place from time. We have met also, for example, a man who was the cook of the Islamic State because he was in his area, but then he is now detained without judicial process and so on. So that's why we think that many of the adults should be also released. I know it's very difficult also to get all the evidence, and this ICRC is not doing it.
Courtney, one thing to bear in mind also in terms of boys who may have actually fought with ISIS, this could well have been involuntary, just as being a cook for ISIS in areas they control can be involuntary, or a mechanic or many other things. But in addition to that, even if a boy wanted to join ISIS on his own, under international law, all children who are recruited to armed groups, whether involuntarily or not, are to be considered first and foremost as victims, even if they are suspected of committing a crime. All of these children in the camps and other detention centers are victims first and foremost. And under international law, that treatment as a victim extends to, is detention really necessary? It should be an exceptional measure of last resort. Is any form of punishment necessary? Is rehabilitation, shouldn't rehabilitation always be the first step? And those are the instructions under international law. And countries, I think it's important to step back and think about whose responsibility here, because I don't wish to imply by my very critical comments that the Northeast Syrian authorities are responsible for the entirety of this mass unlawful detention crisis with implications that reach beyond the 60 countries of nationality. They have implications for the rule of law worldwide. It's not just this non-state actor fighting multiple battles on multiple fronts, including against the Islamic State. There are 60 countries of origin involved here. And under international law, countries have an obligation toward their nationals beyond territorial borders if they can do something reasonable and feasible. I'm not talking about invading, I'm talking about reasonable, feasible, to change the conditions for their nationals if they're facing risk to life or torture, both of which apply here. And yet countries have basically allowed and encouraged their nationals to be locked up and just want to throw away the key. These nationals can't, unless they escape, which is at risk to their own life and limb and breaking all camp rules, they can't get out to reach a consulate, to ask to go back to their country of origin. Almost no countries have provided any consular assistance to these nationals, whereas we're in the age of Zoom. Since COVID, surely trailers could be set up, secure trailers, where people could request, put their names down, request to speak with a consular service from their country of origin, and have that audience remotely. None of this is in place nearly 5 years later. And to me, this is a really shocking indictment of the international community. So I think we need to try to help the Kurdish-led authorities. By we, I mean everybody, to try to do the right thing, because I think there is a lot of will there to do the right thing.
But Anne, it seems like an enormous undertaking, the idea of trying to, in some cases, figure out identities of some of these people who may have no paperwork or proof of who they are, and then saying that they are a certain nationality, and maybe that country doesn't even want to deal with them. And then also, if this is a potential prosecution back in another country, how do you even come about finding evidence? So, I mean, this seems like an almost impossible task for an attorney. So as an attorney, prove me wrong.
No, I think I want to make a few points. So first of all, on the question of prosecution, I mean, this is an issue. The Special Rapporteur has also issued a position paper on the question of prosecution. We've been to numerous countries to see how the prosecutions were happening, because we also have to understand that, of course, there's the question of repatriation from the camps. And one of the reasons put forward has been that that prosecution in the countries of return would be extremely challenging because of the lack of evidence. And another argument that has been put forward is that justice needs to be carried out close to where the victims are. But given that there are no trials in Northeast Syria, and that the trials in Iraq have been, I mean, the question of fairness can be clearly raised. It seems that that's not really giving justice to the victims anyway. And also, frankly, most of these individuals are being tried for acts of terrorism, which in many countries are victimless crimes. It's basically a membership offense, which doesn't really get to who's done what. In the region, there have been some extremely serious international law violations committed by Daesh. That is absolutely clear. And yet, most of the prosecutions have been for membership. And that there's a clear accountability gap there. And so states that can do the right thing and prosecute for core international crimes, including genocide, need to do that work. And some countries are. And it's challenging, but many are simply not. So that's maybe the first point that I want to make. The second point I want to make is that on top of the question of repatriations, many individuals, including men, came back before they were put in the camp. So actually, states do know how to prosecute these individuals, even if it's just on terrorism offenses, which again raises a lot of issues, but mostly I think political, which I'm not going to get into. But the other thing I want to say, and this goes to the initial question of who's responsible for what. It is indeed extremely challenging, and I would agree with Letta that the answer is yes. It's extremely challenging to know who is responsible for what. Opacity that can be the only word that applies. It was extremely difficult to get figures, extremely difficult to know who was where. But maybe let me make 2 points about state responsibility, because there is clearly a responsibility of the detaining authorities, whoever that actually is, in fact. But maybe there's also the question of state responsibility for serious violations of international law. And I just want to make 2 points in relation to that. First, that under international humanitarian law, and that's common Article 1 to the Geneva Conventions, there's an obligation for states to ensure respect for the provisions of international humanitarian law. So states should not only not encourage persons or groups to violate the most fundamental provisions of international humanitarian law, and by that I mean common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions as the basic standards of humanity, but there is a further obligation to take every possible step to safeguard the compliance with the provisions of Common Article 3. And the failure to act diligently and to take the necessary measures that they can incur, in fact, international responsibility. The second point I'd like to make in relation to state responsibility is the obligation under international law to prevent and suppress serious violations of international law, particularly regarding acts that are considered as, obligations that are considered as peremptory norms of international law, or jus cogens, which is the word that we use. And I would note that some of the violations that I mentioned are in fact jus cogens obligations. So under the general law of state responsibility, states are under an obligation not to knowingly aid and assist in the commissions of these, in the violations of these norms, including by knowingly providing an essential facility or financing the activity in question. And state action or omission can also lead to international criminal responsibility in this respect.
Okay, I'm going to show my complete lack of understanding about the legal process here and say, in that case, who's the state? Is it the Northeast Syrian Authority, or is it the Syrian regime? I mean, who's the state that is in violation here?
Well, it could be many states that we know. Look, what we do, again, opacity is the word here.
Yes.
But yes is the answer. What we do know, and we have this in writing by a number of governments, we send out communications to governments, and some of them have written back that they are providing training. It's many states who are members of the International Coalition Against Daesh, for instance. They have written that they are providing security. We know one government that has basically built Panorama Prison. We know that a number of states are providing training to ensure the security of these premises. So these states, again, this is not, I'm just raising a number of issues that could be taken into consideration. This is not for me to say what it is, but just this is the kind of action that could maybe, if elements were clear, and again, I don't have the elements at hand, but I think maybe the question to ask is, and this is obviously on a case-by-case basis, but maybe the question to ask is, would this situation, this 5-year detention situation, be possible if it weren't for the help or the support of states that have nationals who are detained in Northeast Syria?
I also show my complete lack of being a good moderator because I have no idea how much time we have left. Okay, should I start taking questions from the audience? Okay, great. Let's do some Q&A from the audience. And I think we have microphones, or I can lend you mine off my dress here. Sorry, I should have given you more heads up about the mics. I know, me too. I always get, I get too involved in it.
It's okay. I empathize with that. Hi, my name is Nate Rosenblatt. I'm with the State Department. Thank you so much, Marianne and Letta, for these very sobering remarks. And I wanted to pick up where Courtney's question left off and just probe a little further on state responsibility. I think we've seen over the past year in particular, in Europe, for example, court cases, as well as in other countries, court cases have flowed their way through their respective judicial systems, ultimately pointing to states' responsibility to step up and repatriate their nationals. I wonder if you see one of the practical sort of policy implications of the Special Rapporteur's report being to continue to push countries to have those cases go through their judicial systems, in particular to compel states to repatriate the fighters or the alleged fighters in the detention facilities, because we haven't seen much progress on that front. Thank you.
I would hope that the work of the special rapporteur wouldn't just be to bring about more court cases, but it would actually lead states to just repatriate, because that's been the position of the special rapporteur from day one, which is states have an obligation to repatriate. These are their nationals, and they can stop. They can put an end to the very serious violations, life, torture, arbitrary detention, by simply repatriating. And we all know that the approach has been very drip. And yes, I think you're probably referring to the European Court of Human Rights case, which in many ways was a disappointing. We were an amicus. The special rapporteur was an amicus in that case, and we were disappointed that it didn't just clearly call for the repatriation. We understand that politically it was probably quite difficult for the European Court to do, given its already rather complex case law on the issue of jurisdiction. However, it did have the benefit of reintroducing some sort of process in what was basically a complete legal black hole. States could decide to repatriate or not without providing any justification as to why that was the case. So in that sense, now states do have to go through some sort of process. And in fact, what it did was it did lead a number of states, including the state against which that decision was, to repatriate proactively. Because, and I do think that judicial processes can help. And I mean, there's also a case in Canada that was initially quite positive, then a little bit negative, but from what we understand, this case might go to the Supreme Court. And again, that is the kind of decision. This was the first case that actually said that men needed to be repatriated as well, because their situation in many ways was worse than that of the women, because they hadn't been seen or heard of since 2019. So yes, I think it's not the only solution, and states should act before these cases come about. But I think one of the effects of these cases is, yes, indeed, to bring that and to make that happen.
Letta, this is something you focus a lot on. And one thing that I've always been really unclear on is the rules surrounding someone being repatriated. Are you confident, or do you have any concerns about when a citizen is taken back to any of these 50 or 60 countries about their treatment once they get back there?
Yes.
Are there, and who that's it's
a real yes.
Yes, no, yes. Is there anyone who is talking to these countries and saying, well, before we hand your citizens back over to you, we want to ensure that these rights are upheld? Is there anyone who's doing that?
Yes, I mean, there are diplomatic assurances, and this is a diplomatic tool to allow people to go back to countries in spite of international law that says it's prohibited to send someone back to against their will to a place against their will where they face risk to life or of torture, and in some countries also risk of flagrantly unfair trials, which is also a big concern for us. So yeah, we are extremely concerned about repatriations to such countries. On the other hand, I know of women who want to go back to countries with documented records of torture run by people who are routinely targets of groups such as Human Rights Watch, because they say that their treatment and their hopes for their hopes for treatment of their children, they expect to be better. They expect to be less miserable, less tortured than they are in Northeast Syria. Now, whether they're right or wrong, I don't know, but they are making what they believe are expressing informed preferences. And I think that countries should respect that. And of course, the international community, including the US Coalition Against ISIS, the UN, others, should be doing their utmost to ensure that those assurances are met in such circumstances. I also think that yes, I mean, maybe just to step back and clarify on Human Rights Watch's position, because we focus so much on the detainees, the abuse of these detainees. I do want to emphasize that we very much favor rigorous prosecutions of war criminals, and those who committed genocide, the beheaders, the rapists, the bombers, et cetera, the hostage takers. We want to see that happen in a fair process. What we don't want is this continued vacuum not only because it deprives the accused of their rights, not only because it collectively punishes children while leaving those who may have committed acts unpunished, but because it is an insult to victims of ISIS around the world to not bring these people to justice. Families of people who died at the hands of ISIS are not getting their day in court for the individual crimes that these people committed. And so that is a really, really important part of what needs to happen here, in addition to the care for everybody, because even the most heinous suspect deserves to be treated humanely. That's law. That's been the law for a long time, everywhere in the world. So just to clarify, but yeah, we have serious concerns. So our position is that people who do not want to go back should not be forced to return. But I think many people I've spoken with, both male prisoners and women, have said they're willing to go back and face justice in their home countries, even countries where we're saying, really think you're going to have due process there, fair due process. And they say, yes, this is what I want to do. I'd rather serve time there. I can get some family visits. I can communicate. My children have an opportunity to start a real life. So I think countries should really listen hard to that. There are going to be people, though, who can't go back. And that's going to be a harder nut to crack. But the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. And there's a lot more that can be done now, including on the due process front, because if there is a legal mechanism to determine at least who should be brought to trial, then the population can be further reduced. And if indeed an authority of some kind finds before people are repatriated that it's okay to let them go home, that also alleviates some of the pressure that politicians feel in terms of allowing people back. I think for all these reasons, it's really important. And why aren't we why isn't anyone doing video conference calls with lawyers, with judges? A mobile court could be set up. I'm not saying that's necessarily the greatest option, but there's a lot of ways that home countries could start looking at prosecutions even before people are brought back that are not being considered.
Sir? I'll get to this side too, I promise.
Thank you very much. Alexander Kravitz from Insight. I'd like, first of all, to commend Middle East Institute for shedding a light on this, because it was mentioned, it's a forgotten crisis. I have a slew of questions, but I understand about opacity. But I wonder if Anne could tell us about some of the prosecutions that are being made by some of the countries that have nationals there. How many? Because you mentioned that some countries are prosecuting. So I'm curious if you could share with us who, how, some numbers. And something else you mentioned, that Al-Hol should not be called a camp because it's really more an open prison. And here my question is actually to Courtney, it's being the only member of the press. How does NBC refer to Al-Hol in their reporting? And if you were filing a report and you were to call it, the Al-Hol Detention Center or open air prison, I mean, what would your, superior editor say? And I mean, I'm just curious because, words matter, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want to go first? Or?
Yeah, sure. So let me start maybe on the prosecutions in states of origin. Most states, I think, are prosecuting individuals who are repatriated. Some states prosecute everyone, women, men, under terrorism legislation. There are a few exceptions to this. Some states have repatriated, mostly women and children, have taken the clear decision that they would not prosecute the women. They would focus on the rehabilitation side of things. I'm thinking, for instance, countries like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, which are two countries where the special rapporteur actually went and looked at the post repatriation process. Many countries in Europe prosecute everyone upon return, but because the returns have mostly been of women, if not entirely, at least the organized repatriations have been, I think I know 2 exceptions. have been mostly of women, that means that the women are prosecuted. The men so far have not been prosecuted. They have not been repatriated. I would say that we carried out what we called a thematic visit, which is when we focus on a specific issue in several countries. And we looked at the question of repatriation and prosecution. And we went to North Macedonia and to Germany earlier this summer. And Germany is doing a really hard job of prosecuting individuals for core international crimes. And the special rapporteur really praises this because it's closing an accountability gap. Clearly, what has happened, I mean, again, I said it earlier, but I'll say it again. There have been really the most serious international crimes under international law that have been committed on the territory of Northeast Syria. And the idea that you would have such a disconnect between the charges for which these individuals who are returned are being prosecuted and the actual crimes that are committed. So you go in, you're being sentenced for membership, but actually there's acts of genocide that have happened. There needs to be, I mean, the gap is simply too large. So we know that prosecutions for core international crimes are much more complicated. We know that the evidence is also, it's not impossible to secure because again, some states are doing it and they're doing it quite successfully. There are mechanisms that are currently, like for instance, the IIIM, which is in Northeast Syria, and that's been collecting evidence and storing it so that state prosecutors can go and access it. I know that there are a number of governments who are also collecting evidence and making it and putting it at the disposal of other states through mutual agreements. But there are many ways in which these prosecutions can happen. And the proof is that they are happening in some countries. And so we can only encourage more states to be doing that really hard job. But that would also include repatriating the men and using those mechanisms as well where necessary.
Is most of the evidence, I think it's so fascinating that you characterize it as prosecutions for membership and that the actual crimes that some of these people have been committed, they're not even brought to the table. But is most of the evidence that is brought when there is an actual crime being looked at based off of witness testimony? Or are there ways that something that's years old, they could still get physical evidence to?
So this is a very complex question. Let me just say that in many of these simple terrorism offenses in many countries require very low levels of evidence. In some cases, the fact that you have been in the territory of Northeast Syria at a certain point or within a certain time frame is sufficient for you to be prosecuted for membership. So it's very easy. You don't need much evidence. In some cases, a simple Facebook post would be sufficient, right? For sure, if you're prosecuting for other core international crimes, you're going to need much more solid, complex evidence. You don't prove genocide very easily. You don't prove crimes against humanity very easily either. So for that, you are going to need probably to get evidence from Northeast Syria. But again, there are mechanisms and states that have been collecting evidence and that other states can and should frankly use. And that would also, I think, be a way to encourage states to repatriate the men if they know that they can prosecute them for what they've actually done.
Yeah.
And I also think fundamentally that's a really good deterrent to terrorism.
Thank you. When I've been to Al Hol, we call it a displaced persons camp, a refugee camp, and I'll tell you why. So we always make an effort to provide additional context on what that means, to say that this is a displaced person camp, but it's a place where people are not allowed to come and go. So there's the element of them being detained there without saying that everyone who is in there has committed a crime. Which I think when you tell an audience this is a detention facility, it means everyone has been brought in there because of some association with a crime. And one thing that we do know, even though the numbers are very murky, as everyone up here has established, is that many of the people there, they went there after the fall of Baghouz or even before Baghouz, and they were women and kids and people who didn't necessarily have an association with ISIS. They just happened to be there and they got stuck there. So I understand, and I actually wrote that down when Anne said that as well, an open air prison, because I can see how that is how it seems to a lot of people, but there are a lot of innocent people who are still there, despite the fact they can't leave, come and go, who really are refugees who can't go home. Yeah, I know believe me, it's a difficult, I completely take your point, and it's a difficult, and I think the words do matter here. You're absolutely right about that. We have time for another one, right? Sir?
Thank you. I'm Bruce Krause, a director of ICSR. And thank you so much for presenting this horrific picture of the conditions in whatever we call these places. I'd like to revisit the opacity issue, which I know is impossible to answer in a crisp way, the question, who is responsible for this, and to just answer with one word. But I'd like to encourage the panel to perhaps provide a list of suspects and to help. You've mentioned, for example, the countries of origin. Can you give some examples of the countries you're thinking about who, in some sense, you're holding responsible? You've mentioned security services who seem, in their access to these detainees, perhaps to have some influence over the situation. I don't know. But can you give some example of the nations that back those security services? Just two more. There's been references to Northeast Syrian authorities. Maybe I'm the only one in the room who doesn't actually know whether you're talking about one authority or several different of the 5 or 6 competing groups in Syria. You've kind of let the central government of Syria off the hook, which I don't quite understand. But the final question, the one that you haven't mentioned at all, who's paying for this? The guy who's doing the torture has a boss who can fire him, who's got a boss who's getting paid, who's got a boss who's getting the money from someplace. And that source is probably a nation state who I think has some responsibility for this. And I don't know what you think about any of that.
That was a lot of questions. I don't know who wants to take them, maybe one at a time.
Anne, you want to go first?
We could start with who's paying for it,
Okay.
who's backing this.
Yeah, I mean, I think who's responsible? All countries with nationals in Northeast Syria are responsible for the well-being of their citizens. So that's about 60 countries. I would exclude any country that has actually taken back every one of their nationals, and I include the men and the boys who have aged into men and the boys who haven't yet. So I'm not talking exclusively about women and children in camps, because a lot of countries say we've repatriated everybody, but oh, guess what? Actually, they haven't repatriated the men or the boys who become men, or even the boys. So there are countries from all around the world, yes, of every different political stripe. So I would hold all countries ultimately responsible for the well-being, and suggest that all countries could ultimately be considered in violation of very serious international legal standards, perhaps reaching the threshold of crimes against humanity. And that is a very serious risk that I think countries should take really seriously. But I'm not going to name names, because I think I'm going to name one country, and actually maybe another country is even more responsible. But I do think that but I hold them all, and I would also hold the US-led coalition against ISIS responsible, because they're providing a lot of manpower, perhaps some women power, material, et cetera, and investing a lot in the region. And we're delighted that the coalition is interested in improving the conditions for these detainees, but we would really like to see a lot more done. But we also would like to see the emphasis shift from a purely or predominantly military response to this crisis to one that is more all-encompassing and humanitarian. But I do think that the International Coalition Against ISIS could play a greater role than it currently is. It could do more, including on starting to set up some sort of basic due process. If the UN has done a lot, it's doing more. I think it could still do better. So I hold all of those entities responsible, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that I would hold all of them responsible in terms of complicity necessarily. But I do think, as Anne said, that there is that potential there. In terms, what was the next question? Syrian government, why are we leaving them off the hook? There are a number of there's a complex war going on. And of course, even in recent days, although events in Israel and Gaza obviously overtook world's attention, there were quite a lot of attacks going on in northeast Syria recently, and that has further hampered humanitarian aid. I think Syria is the government of Syria is very much involved in what's going on the border. It's very much involved in northeast Syria. There are government of Syria troops there. There are Russian forces there. We know that there's a number of forces. And so Assad's conduct definitely has repercussions. So yes, I hold them responsible as well. If the Assad government were a government that the international community could trust to take charge of this, to shepherd this crisis through to a resolution, abiding by rule of law, then governments would not be reluctant to set up trials in Syria, for example, but that's clearly impossible. So I do hold the government of Syria responsible. It is their territory, but I hold them responsible for a lot more than this particular crisis. Who's paying for this? Well, the US-led coalition and many of its members. That includes the US, that includes the UK, that includes the EU, that includes other individual countries. And I don't want to suggest that countries should not be paying for better structures for these detainees, because we should not say that because we want everybody repatriated immediately, that everybody should live in utterly degrading conditions in the meantime, or conditions where truly dangerous people can break out and regroup into ISIS. No, but is there the same emphasis on improving conditions? No, we are not seeing that, regrettably. And I understand it's a lot harder to raise money for that, but that is a long-term investment that can be the best counterterrorism strategy overall. If you improve conditions, you are going to make people less susceptible to being drawn into or being drawn back into ISIS or groups of its ilk.
And one thing, and I won't ask up here because it's outside of all of your lane, sort of, but how does this evolve as there's seeming normalization of relations with Syria is spreading through the Gulf? And how will that change the situation here? And that may be a question that 5 or 10 years from now we can answer, but
it's interesting. Some countries have repatriated through Syria. Countries with good relations with Damascus have successfully repatriated that way. So I would say, in that sense, we should give some credit where credit is due for allowing that process, for the Assad government to allow that process to move forward. And so for countries that don't feel comfortable negotiating with Northeast Syria, that can be an option. But if it's a country that does not want to have relations with Syria, obviously that gets trickier. But countries such as Canada, which I would say I would not consider the best friend of the Assad government. I don't want to get into politics here, but you wouldn't sort of think, okay, who are Assad's key allies in the international community? Canada. No, Canada successfully repatriated more than 24 of its nationals from Syria, not Northeast Syria, during COVID. If Canada can repatriate more than 24 nationals from Syria during COVID and thousands of its nationals around the world during COVID, including quite a few tricky hotspots, surely it can take home another 8 men and a small handful of children and mothers, children whose mothers are not Canadian. It seems to me that these are, if there's a will, there's a way.
One more question, probably, I think we have time for. sir? Is that okay? Okay, thanks.
Andrew Scott with the Open Mind Project. Just a quick clarification. So the Syrian Defense Forces are operating most of these camps and they're being funded by, I mean, because I didn't really feel like we got an answer of who is funding.
You're right. I got lost
but
on question
We're
4.
backing, the US is backing SDF, right? And SDF is operating. I mean, I'm just trying to get some clarification on it.
It's different per location too, right? Not everyone
Right.
is consistent, but
Yeah. So I'm not going, I mean, again, opacity is really what I would say. This is not, states are not putting forward very transparently, except some are actually. And maybe I would just point to some, we've written communications, which is what we do when there are allegations that there's a human rights problem, we write to governments and we ask for explanations, and these letters eventually become public. They're on our website, as do the answers of the governments to which we have written. So maybe I could just point to some of those communications which might, we wrote one on prisons and men in prisons, and we sent 2 separate letters on this case, one to the US and to the UK. There were allegations that the UK had been funding, had paid for Panorama Prison. The answer of the UK government is on the website as well. And we sent it also to the US. There were allegations that the US had been providing capacity building and training. And we sent another similar letter to many countries who are part of the coalition against ISIL. Again, clearly the coalition doesn't, it's not, you don't know who's paying for what, but I mean, there are lots of journalists in the room. So I would only encourage journalists to maybe just follow the money trail.
it's interesting you said allegations, because I mean, the US military does support Hall, some of the detention facilities. They've even built, if I'm not mistaken, I may be remembering this incorrectly, but didn't the US military help them build the walls in between the sections of a hall, and they reinforced one of the prisons in Hasaka? I mean, I think it's
The US military and the coalition have spent hundreds of millions of dollars in training, counterterrorism training, and also in reinforcing buildings in Northeast Syria. And that's actually, you can find it in the quarterly Inspector General's reports on these operations. So it's quite public knowledge. I mean, there are increasing numbers of classified annexes to these reports, but there is a fair amount of public information out there. A lot of it is going to training to the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is indeed the main detaining force. Then there's the Ashaish, who are the security, the sort of the equivalent of the police, if you will, or kind of a quasi-military police. Ostensibly, the rehabilitation centers and the camps are managed more by the so-called autonomous administration of Northeast Syria. Northeast Syria is, for all practical purposes, it functions as an autonomous, or I'd say at least quasi-autonomous entity. But in terms of the power dynamics of the relationship between the Syrian Democratic Forces and the autonomous administration, I would say, is complex and fluid. There have been, of course, allegations that the PKK in Turkey is pretty much overseeing what the SDF does. I'm not going to comment on any of that. It's not what I look at. But just to say that, you know, there are those allegations out there, which makes funding the SDF quite tricky. On the other hand, let's not forget the Syrian Democratic Forces lost well over 12,000. I don't recall the number now. It might be 14,000 or more fighters defeating the physical caliphate in Northeast Syria. And these are the forces on the ground who have paid a very, very heavy price for defending the world from ISIS. And they have been indispensable to the US-led coalition. So I think there is, again, despite all of my criticisms of the conditions, there is credit should be made where credit is due to what this force has done. And they have periodically threatened to just release all the detainees if they don't get more money to ensure that they're properly cared for. But they haven't gone through with this threat, and I don't think they will. But I can sympathize with their frustration, frankly. They also feel abandoned by the international community, which wants them to keep these people locked up indefinitely, but won't help them prosecute, won't help them come up with other solutions, and is just content to look away. So what are they supposed to do?
That was fascinating. And very sobering panel, but I think everyone here learned a lot. I know I definitely did. And it's an issue that I feel is close to my heart. So thank you all so much for your time and your expertise. It was really unbelievably fascinating. Thank you.